Trouble River by Betsy Byers, Chapter 7, Tragedy in the Ashes. When they were back on the raft and Grandma in her chair again, Dewey pulled the raft around the mud bank and into the main stream of the river. "Steady, boy," Grandma said. "Yes'm." After a moment he was aware that Grandma had no further instructions for him, and he looked and saw that she had fallen asleep. Silently they drifted down the river. They passed a long treeless bank, and Dewey could see the golden stretch of grass beyond and the streaks of red sumac that laced it. Now he began to think of the Dargans. He had just passed the high clay bluff he had noticed often from the trail, and the Dargans' cabin was not more than an hour or two away. He must stay awake and alert. It would not do to pass by. He moved the raft closer to the left bank so that stopping would not be a problem. The Dargan family had been here on the prairie longer than any other family, and Mr. Dargan, a tall, strong man with a beard that reached to his belt buckle, would take them in as warmly as if they were his own kin. In his mind, Dewey could hear Mr. Dargan's voice, welcoming but concerned, saying, come in, Margaret, get Mrs. Martin and Dewey something hot to drink." And drawing him aside, he would say, "All right, Dewey lad, tell me what the trouble is." And what a relief it would be to tell of their trouble and to place the responsibility on broader shoulders. He watched the left side of the river eagerly, for he was afraid that the cabin would not be visible from the river. It was set back in the shelter of another smaller bluff, Chimney Bluff it was called, because of the high stack of rocks on the top. It was this pile of rocks that Dewey was watching for. He thought of the good hot supper Mrs. Dargan would fix for them. His cold lunch felt like a hard knot in his stomach, and he thought of the soft, sweet-smelling grass mattress in the loft. He and his grandma would stay until his parents came by on their way home. His pa and ma always stopped at the Dargans, and then the four of them would ride home together, 5 now with the baby. His eyes burned from the glare of the water and from lack of sleep, but he continued to look for the bluff. He felt a heightening of spirits now that the journey was nearing its end, and he allowed himself to whisper excitedly to Charlie, "We'll be there in just a bit." The dog had begun to pull at the bandage that bound his leg, as if that were the cause of his pain. Dewey put down the oar, tied the bandage more securely, and said again, "We'll be there in just a bit." The words did not comfort the dog, but they made Dewey feel better. He straightened and began to whistle. With a start, his grandma awoke. "How long did I sleep?" she asked anxiously. "A couple of hours. Did you get on along all right?" "Yes'm." "I was afraid you might have run into some trouble." "No'm, I did all right." "Seems like we ought to be seeing the Dargan place before long," she said. "I brought along my crocheting so Mrs. Dargan could get me started on a new pattern." Already, she too pictured herself in the cabin, happily chatting with Mrs. Dargan. "You know, it ain't been a bad trip, boy," she said. She smoothed her skirt, then straightened her collar and bonnet. "No, it ain't," he agreed. "Maybe you can bring me down the river again sometime next spring," she said. "We could come down, spend a night or two at the Dargans, and then go home." "Yes'm." Dewey did not spoil her plans by mentioning that the raft would not go back up the river. It was a thought he himself did not like. At the Dargans, his raft would have to be abandoned, and he would never have those long, happy hours at home again with it. "Ain't that Chimney Bluff, boy?" With her cane, she pointed ahead, where a tall pile of rocks could be seen, angled awkwardly against the hard blue sky. "That's it." He dipped his oar into the water and then paddled in short, nervous strokes on the right side of the raft. "Get ready to stop, boy." "Yes'm." "Only wait till we get closer." "Yes'm." "I'll tell you when to stop." "Yes'm." He pulled the raft closer to the shore. He could see wild blackberries on a vine and a tiny green snake hanging over the water, its head lifted to watch their passing. "Don't miss the bank, boy." "I won't," he said loudly. Although the raft was now out of the current and moving slowly, Dewey was still tense. His hands gripped the oar so tightly that his knuckles showed white beneath the tanned skin. He dipped the oar again and again into the water, nervously marking time. His mud-stiffened breeches scratched against his legs. He was so close to the bank that he could not see the cabin at all, but when his grandma said, "Now, boy!" without hesitating, he thrust the raft into the shore and grabbed the weeds on the bank with his free hand. They bumped against the bank and stopped. Dewey leaned weakly on his oar for a moment. Then he said, "I'll take her down there to that stump." Slowly he let the raft glide a few yards and secured it with the rope. "We're here," he said. His grandma stood up and looked at the weed-covered bank. "Can't you take us to where it ain't so steep, boy?" "You wait here, Grandma. I'll go up and get Mr. Dargan." "Yes," she agreed eagerly. "Tell Mr. Dargan to come down here and help me up the bank. Now, don't fiddle around, boy. Get him straight away." "Yes'm." "Don't play us to stop or nothing." "I won't, Grandma," he said impatiently. He scrambled up the bank with his hands, clutching the long weeds for support. At the top, he stopped to look down at his grandma, sitting erect in her chair. As he paused, he saw her reach into her satchel to take out her gold-rimmed spectacles. These were her most prized possession. She often said that she was the only woman west of the Mississippi who had gold-rimmed glasses. Now she put them on, carefully hooking them behind each ear. She glanced up at Dewey through the small glass circles, and he said quickly, "I'm going right now." The prairie wind, warm and gentle, blew against him as he ran toward the low trees that surrounded the Dargins' cabin. His hair tossed in the wind as he ran, happy that the journey was over and that he and Rosie B had stood up to it. Behind him, the dog limped on 3 legs, straining to keep up. It was unbearable for him to have to run behind the boy when he had always been the leader, first up the path, first in the cabin, first to see what was over the hill. He barked his displeasure once, but Dewey did not wait for him. His bare feet flashed in the grass, and a prairie chicken scuttled out of the way. "Mr. Dargin! Mr. Dargin!" he called. As he came closer to the trees, he began to run more slowly. Then he walked. Then he stood perfectly still, not even aware of the grass blowing against his legs, for suddenly he had a feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was such a strong feeling that he wanted to turn and run back to the raft without going to the cabin at all. There was an unnatural stillness beyond the trees. No one answered his call. No smoke curled up from the chimney, yet there was the smell of it in the air. Slowly Dewey walked to the trees. His throat was so dry he could not swallow. He pushed through the low branches, and what he saw in the clearing ahead made him close his eyes and hold tightly to a tree. There before him lay the blackened ruin of the cabin. The logs, once sturdy and straight, were now charred and fallen, and the ashes that had been scattered by the wind so that the earth too was black. Only the chimney, still high and strong, was left to show that there had once been a cabin. Dewey walked forward. He stepped to where the entrance had been. The hinges Mr. Dargin had brought from their old home in Virginia were still there, hanging from a log. Dewey knelt and felt the log, turned it and felt it again. Beneath there was still a faint warmth. The cabin had been burned about 2 days ago, he guessed, and he suddenly felt cold with fear. His pa and ma, if they had stayed here an extra day, only 1 extra day, they would have been trapped with the Dargins. He rose slowly as he surveyed the whole of the ruins, looking with dread for some sign of his parents. His shoulders suddenly felt heavy and tired, as if he were carrying an unbearable burden. The barn was gone, burned like the cabin, and the horses, the fine mustangs, were nowhere to be seen. There was nothing but charred wood and ashes. "Dewey!" "Yes'm," he answered in a voice that was barely audible in the clearing. "Dewey!" "I'm coming," he yelled. The dog was sniffing in the ruins, running eagerly from place to place, poking his nose into the ashes. "Come on," Dewey said. "Come on, Charlie." Charlie ignored him and sniffed the ground. "I said for you to come on, and I mean it. Now get!" He picked up a bit of wood and threw it at him. The dog dodged awkwardly on 3 legs and looked at Dewey. "Now come on!" Reluctantly, the dog followed. As they left the clearing, the ashes blew against their legs. Dewey did not look back. He crossed the meadow slowly with his eyes on the ground. His face was pale, and there was a white circle around his lips. As he walked, suddenly the sky above him was streaked with geese flying south. The sound of their honking calls filled the air, but Dewey did not even look up. He walked, the dog at his heels, toward the river. His grandma heard the footsteps, and she said eagerly, "Over here, Mr. Dargin, I'm over here." "Then, is that you, Mr. Dargin?" "No'm, it's me." He stood at the bank for a moment, and she looked up into his face, pinched and small above his faded shirt. She was silent. She knew at once that something was wrong, but her mind could not accept what it might be. "Where's Mr. Dargin?" she asked finally. He did not say anything for a long moment. He looked at his feet. Then he said, "The Dargins ain't there." Now she read the truth in his face, and she closed her eyes, and her chin crumpled up like thin paper. Her hands trembled in her lap, but when she spoke, her voice was almost steady. "Well, that's a shame," she said. "I'm real sorry we don't find them at home." "Yes'm." He was grateful she was going to pretend that nothing was wrong. He could not have told her what he had seen, and now in the cool shelter of the trees, it seemed almost not to have happened. I'm just disappointed because I was needing some help with my crocheting," she said, as if to explain the tears she was brushing from her cheeks. "I know you was. Well, don't just stand there, boy. Get back on the raft. If the Dargins ain't at home, we'll just have to keep going down the river." He grabbed the dog, who was looking back toward the cabin, and slid down the bank with him. Without a word, he got back on the raft, unhooked the rope, took up his oar, and pushed the raft down into the river. Both he and Grandma were silent as Chimney Bluff slipped from sight. Then, with great care, his grandma took off her gold-rimmed glasses and put them back in her velour satchel. After a moment, she said, "You didn't see no sign of your ma and pa, did you, boy? The wagon or the horses?" "No, I didn't see much of anything. I reckon they're already in Hunter City, then. They're probably having themselves a fine time right now," he said with false cheerfulness. He would not even let himself think that his parents might have been at the Dargins' cabin when the Indians came. They were in Hunter City. They had to be.